Grab your popcorn and snacks. Find a comfy spot, take a seat or lie down, and let me transport you to a place of fantasy, ghost stories, ancient legends, odd creatures, alien encounters, and other magical topics. You may even decide to join the conversation. From faraway lands to your own backyard, with a small dash of pixie dust, turn out the lights and open your minds. The journey is about to begin. Hey, welcome to California Haunts Radio tonight. We have got a great show lined up tonight. As you can see, I've gone festive in my background. I told you guys that one of our producers donated a new Christmas backdrop. Because if you remember last year, if you were here, I had like a blue Alaskan thing going on with snowy trees and stuff, so I was freezing. Anyway, so she wanted me to have a more woodsy thing going on. So here I am in my little Christmas cabin. Yeah. Anyway, welcome. My name is Charlotte, and I'm going to be your host tonight for the next hour. I own and operate the California Haunts Paranormal Investigation Team here in Sacramento. But not only in Sacramento, which kind of makes it cool. It also is located throughout the state of California, Oregon, Washington, Nevada, and parts of Hawaii. We have team members, so I'm real excited to say that. We're nonprofit, so if you have any issues, that you think might be paranormal, shoot us an email, and you can shoot that email to www.californiahaunts.net. ORG, I'm sorry. I got so many California Haunts things going on. So it's www.californiahaunts.org. Shoot us an email there, and I'll give you a call, and we can talk about what's going on and see if we can help you, or we can refer you elsewhere, or whatever you need. In the meantime, you're listening to California Haunts Radio, www.californiahauntsradio.com. And I'm really excited. Dr. J. Gordon Melton is with us tonight to talk about vampires. And I don't think we're going to be talking about the Twilight kind. I think we're going to be talking about other kinds, I think vampire legend over the years, and I remember taking horror film classes in college, Nosferatu and things like that. But I think there's legends for it, but the actuality of what it was and what people thought was vampires is a lot different from what the legends are. So we're going to start right now, okay? Sounds good. Let's do this. Hello, sir.
Good evening.
How are you?
Oh, doing quite well.
Can you tell me a little bit about yourself?
Oh, I'm a professor at Baylor University. My daytime job, I study American religious history and teach about it. And the rest of the time, I'm a great fan of vampires and vampire movies and vampire legends, vampire novels and vampire paraphernalia and the like, and have been for most of my life.
What got you interested in vampires?
That's a very good question. I've thought about it a lot in recent years, and I started out reading science fiction, and then I found my way to horror, and then discovered vampires and decided they were just better than all the rest. And I grew up at a time when the Hammer movies were coming out. One of the few people I think left that saw Christopher Lee debut on the big screen sitting in a theater rather than on television. But those color movies that Hammer made, the first vampire movies in color, and I just thought they were the greatest thing going.
Absolutely. So what can you tell us? I mean, obviously, vampires are not Twilight. They're not the guys from Twilight, right? They're completely different from what's in Twilight. So what can you tell us about it?
Well, to say something about Twilight, if you're a 13, 14-year-old young woman, vampires of Twilight are probably the best thing that you have found, and are perfectly great for you. Well, for the rest of us, that's as well. I'm much more a Dracula fan, and I think I always will be. Though I must admit that I was a regular Tuesday night listener to Buffy for all of the years that she hunted down vampires, and then, of course, kept up with Angel after that. And so I was always a great fan.
So when you look back through the years, what is one of the earliest accounts of a vampire?
Vampires actually begin with written history. 6,000 years ago, in the earliest strands of literature that we have left in Greek, there's a vampire character that shows up in North Africa and Libya called the Lamia. The Lamia is a female vampire that is somewhat serpent-like. If you can imagine a mermaid in which the bottom half of the mermaid is not a fish fin, but a serpent's body and tail, and the woman who is the other part of the creature is very much like a mermaid, except she has fangs and she goes out and attacks children in the wee hours of the morning and sucks the blood from them. So that seems to be the original vampire, the female vampire who in real life had lost her baby and now spends her time attacking other mothers and taking their child from them as a way of dealing with her grief.
Very interesting. Why do you think the legends of vampires came to be?
I think they formed a function in pre-scientific society. As civilization began to develop, there were a lot of vitally important questions that the state of knowledge at the time did not answer. Mostly questions about birth and death.
Mm-hmm.
So that the first vampires were all about the birth end of the spectrum, about the problems of birth, the problems of infants, the strange things that would happen to them, the oddities of birth, that those births that were out of the norm.
Mm-hmm.
And among the earliest stories we have of vampires are societies focusing upon those children born under unusual circumstances. For example, about 1 person in 1,000 is born with a caul on their face, a membrane. We know now that that's just a perfectly normal thing that happens to some people, but in the ancient world, that was a very unusual, inexplicable thing, and that would mark a child as someone who was different. On the other end of the spectrum, the vampire explained a number of things about unusual deaths, people who died before their time, people who died in accidents, people who died away from the village. These are people that would come back and haunt and attack the folks that they knew and loved in real life. Today, we would tend to explain that particular phenomena in terms of grief work.
Mm-hmm.
When we are involved with someone and they are suddenly taken from them, emotionally, we have not had time to finish our life with them. And especially if that contains negative elements in what we have not done, then we are perfect candidates for the dead to come back to us and haunt us. And that was why it was seen that vampires always attacked the ones they loved.
Right.
That it was the ones they had unfinished emotional business with. Also, as a matter of what today we would call sanitation and the need to protect ourselves from disease. Uh, Older cultures had very strict rules about how a dead person should be treated,
Mm-hmm.
how the body should be cleaned, how it should be buried and cared for. And if you did not do your duty to the dead for whom you were responsible, then that person was seen as one who would come back and attack you as a vampire. So the vampire had very special tasks in ancient society and explained things. Among them, the very important things that it explained certain kinds of diseases that
Mm-hmm.
would spread among people. Tuberculosis being the most obvious one. It's a wasting disease. If you would think of a person who the vampire would attack over a period of time, each time draining a little bit of their blood, it was like the TB patient who lingers and langers and gets worse and worse and paler and finally passes away from this wasting disease that nobody knew how to take care of up until the 20th century.
Interesting, very interesting. Because you think back and all that, and then you have the people that were. I mean, like through history, Vlad the Inhaler. I'm sorry, Vlad the Impaler. I'm so sorry. I don't know why I was thinking about that. You know what I mean? But yeah, for like Vlad the Impaler, and well known as, people think of him as a vampire, but I mean he wasn't. It was just the way he killed people, wasn't it?
It was. Vlad the Impaler is a guy who comes from a very small and obscure country prior to the 1890s. If you didn't live and grow up in Romania, you would never have heard of Vlad the Impaler. But he turns out to be a very important character in history. He did a lot of interesting and daring things, and he changed history in very significant ways. He was the model for a character we know a little bit better than him, a fellow
Mm-hmm.
named Ivan the Terrible, who was
Okay.
the ruler of Russia. Uh, the legends about Vlad filters into Russia and became emboldened and enlarged around Ivan the Terrible. And much of what we know of Ivan's life, the
Mm-hmm.
legend about Ivan, very much like the legends about Vlad, except 10 times worse. And you can see the influence of the stories told about Vlad as we look at Ivan. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
but he gets rediscovered along the way as Stoker is writing Dracula, and
Right.
he provides some material. Uh, Stoker actually knew very, very little about Vlad personally. He had one history volume on the history of Transylvania, written by a man named Wilkerson, and uh, he mined that for all it was worth, and then he creates this character who has very little space in the novel. And you could pull out most of the stuff about Dracula and not lose a lot of the novel. But at the last minute, as he had finished typing the final draft and
Mm-hmm.
ready to turn it in to the publisher to be published, he crosses out the title of his book, The Undead, and writes Dracula at the head of it. And he turns this obscure 15th century ruler from the country of Wallachia. Romania didn't even exist at this time. This province of Wallachia turns him into a world famous character. And I don't know how self-conscious he was about what he did, but renaming his novel was a work of genius.
Is it true that people were so afraid of vampires that when people that when loved ones died or someone that was suspected of being a vampire, they would put like iron gates and stuff over the top of the grave so that they would stay in?
And yeah, as you move from culture to culture, the people would do all kinds of things. This is part of the sustenance of Eastern Europe, where people have been pointed out as potential vampires. So when you go to bury them, and remember there are no undertakers, there are no coffins. You wrap them in a shroud and you bury them as deeply as you have time to.
Mm-hmm.
They're not 6 feet deep, they may be 18 inches or 2 feet deep. And the, so if you suspect that they are a vampire, then there are a number of cautionary things you can do. You can stake them to the ground, turn them upside down, chop off their head, put garlic in their mouth.
Sure.
There are various kinds of barriers that you can put between the person and the surface. Originally, these barriers weren't to protect them from coming up, but to protect wild animals from digging down and gnawing on the bones, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
The flesh had decayed. One of the things you could do is put scatter seed across the top of the grave, with the idea that the vampire, before he wandered away from the grave, would have to count each of the seeds.
Mm-hmm.
And if you put a wealth of seeds across the grave, then this would delay until dawn, and then he would have to go back to the grave, and if he got up the next night, have to count the seeds again. And so that was one way you protected yourself. So, but as you move from culture to culture, there are all kinds of different things that
Sure.
are done. If you suspected there was a vampire coming after your children, there were magical amulets that were
All right.
specifically made for the children, and things you could put around their bedding at night to protect them. Iron was a very important part of that. We think in terms of silver now, but 200 years ago, silver was very, very rare
Yeah.
in the average person's home, and to get silver that would protect would be a thing. That would be something a small amulet might be
Mm-hmm.
made out of, but iron was the substance that really was the protective thing.
Interesting. Like I told you in the initial email, my father's Hungarian. I'm half Hungarian, and vampire stories were rampant in my house. I mean, that was the whole thing, like the original Dracula movies, and a lot of people don't realize this, and I didn't realize it until I was in college, because when I took the horror film class, when we were watching these Dracula movies, it dawned on me that when you look at all the writing, I'm talking the Bela Lugosi ones,
Yeah.
when you're looking at the little towns and everything, and the writing on the stores and stuff, it's all in Hungarian.
Right. Yes.
And I think it's because Lugosi didn't speak English. He knew a few English words. That's how he got through I'm Dracula. I mean, at that point, in his career.
Yeah.
And so it's funny because it's all Hungarian, and I brought it. I came home and I said, Dad, I don't think my dad even noticed till I pointed it out. But I also, as a kid, maybe about 8 or 9, maybe 10 years old, we went to Hungary, spent a month there, and my father, was my father, and I remember him saying, well, before we go to bed tonight, I just want to point something out. I've locked the windows. And I said, well, why did you lock the windows? And he says, because we're about 10 miles from Transylvania. And I said, and I looked at him, my eyes got real big, and he says, and you know who lives there? So yeah, that was my whole month in Hungary. I was hiding all night, waiting for the vampire to come.
Well, know obviously that when Dracula is written, Transylvania is still part of Hungary, and so
Mm-hmm.
when the Harker makes his trip at the beginning of the novel, at the beginning of the movie, to
Yeah.
Pennsylvania, he's going to Hungary, and it's
Mm-hmm.
only in 1918 that Transylvania is given to Romania as part of the spoils of the War of World War One.
Well, makes perfect sense
And,
now. Yeah.
uh, I know on my visits there's still a tremendous amount of Hungarian survivors in Transylvania, and
Mm-hmm.
it's an interesting country because of the Hungarian Catholic Church and the Romanian Orthodox Church mix and match in odd and different ways, especially in the center of the cities of the part of the world.
Well, we always laugh. My father, last 20 years of his life had false teeth. And the thing is, when he would take his teeth out, he had two fangs. So we would laugh, and he would laugh. He'd say, "Look, I'm going out for the night." He'd take the teeth out. He'd be like, "Yep, if I'm not around, you know where I'm at. I'm sucking somebody's blood." All the Hungarian blood. What do you think over the years, looking at the different versions of the vampire? I mean, we had, like you talked about the first one, the first, Nosferatu. I mean, Nosferatu was scary to watch, even for a silent movie. Yeah, that was some scary stuff because he was
Yes.
scary looking. But as vampires in the movies have evolved, how do you feel about the way they've evolved? I mean, because we went from that to the nice ones, and well, not so nice, but I mean, still the Twilight vampires, completely different from, say, Nosferatu. From the beginning of all this.
Well, I grew up on the villainous vampire,
Mm-hmm.
of course, and of course, uh, you should make note of the fact that next year is the centennial of Nosferatu.
Oh,
It
cool.
originally appeared in 1922, and there will be some celebrations that are already beginning to be planned for recognizing the 100th year of the movie. Still a great movie and still entertaining after all these many years. Um, I grew up on the villainous vampire. Uh, I thought that was it.
Mm-hmm.
But I recognized as I was coming of age that there were other vampires that were beginning to appear.
Sure.
I was a great fan of Vampirella, for example, the female extraterrestrial vampire.
Right.
She's the first of the vampire heroines, so to speak. And then from Vampirella, this becomes a ever-present scene. In the mid-1970s, Saberhagen, uh, the famous science fiction writer, wrote his Dracula book, The Dracula Tape, and in which Dracula gets in the back of a car in England in the modern day, and it's the middle of summer, but it's snowing, and the car is stuck on the M5 in England, and he turns on a recording tape to tell his side of the story of what happened. What Stoker wrote about was wrong, and he was really the hero. He was trying to save Lucy when he bit her and turned her into a vampire. She was dying, and he gave her a chance to continue to live because she was so young and beautiful. And then of course, Anne Rice and comes along. And before Anne Rice was Dark Shadows. Dark
Mm-hmm.
Shadows was the first of the conflicted vampires, the vampires who didn't want to be a vampire but had this choice that in order to live they had to take blood from the living and kill people in the process, and this tortured them. It tortured Barnabas, and it tortured the vampires that Anne Rice writes about. And it took me a long while to realize that uh, we were fortunate that we had such good storytellers with these first uh, positive vampires and conflicted vampires, because they enlarged the world of vampires so much. Vampires were no longer these uh, cut to size villains who always were one thing. They were now all everything. They were good guys, bad guys, and everything in between. And
Right.
this meant you could expand the stories of vampires in ways that had never been possible before. And that's why we had this marvelous time at the end of the 20th century where the vampire stories just kept going and growing, and you thought that, my goodness, we must have exhausted this theme by now. And every time we did, we thought that some new and exciting and different take on the vampire came along. You have some really great ones that emerge.
Mm-hmm.
Buffy, of course, I think is the most prominent one, but Blade, the Vampire Slayer
Mm-hmm.
stories, very, very good. Uh, and the comic book world just proliferated with vampires. At one time, I literally had 10,000 comic books in my house, uh, and each of them contained a different vampire story. It's hard to imagine that out of those 10,000, probably 8,000 of them were unique new vampire stories written by
Right.
the great comic book artists that come along. So I was somewhat amazed. In 1997, I was in charge of putting together the Dracula Centennial that was held in Southern California. And we had watched year by year for 20 years more, the number of vampire movies, the number of vampire books, the number of vampire stories were going up every year. And it went from uh, one a month to two a week.
Mm-hmm.
And there were literally more than 50 novels produced in 1992, for example. And we said, this has got to stop. You cannot sustain this many stories
Mm-hmm.
and have something publishable. So that this must be growing, and after the centennial is over, then things will get back to the way they were, say, in 1980, where there were 3 or 4 new vampire novels that year. But it didn't happen that way. No sooner did we get through with the centennial celebration than word comes out that the Buffy television show is starting. The number of new books and movies kept increasing, and we kept having, and this is just in the English language. It
Mm-hmm.
doesn't have anything to do with what's happening in German and French and Spanish and other languages. In Japan, there was this big vampire world that developed there that produced these marvelous manga uh, stories, very, very different from the West in Toto, very different mythology. And it's only been, in the last 2 or 3 years that we're finally beginning to see a shrinkage in the number of new novels and books and movies. Uh, there are now more than 2,500 feature vampire films.
Wow.
2,500. Uh, I haven't been able to track them all down. Most of them, I just know I've got DVDs of about 1,000 vampire movies that I've been able to collect and have No, I can prove it exists. I have a copy of it. But there's 1,500 more that I have good reason to believe are out there, and I just haven't been able to track down a copy of them yet.
Do you think with the anniversary of Nosferatu that there's going to be another resurgence?
I think there will be a few uh, new films. There, of course, are making a third remake of Salem's Lot, I understand. And Salem's Lot is probably the best homage to Nosferatu that's been done.
Mm-hmm.
That's one of the things that will happen next year. I think there will be various attempts to celebrate the anniversary with new books and films and comic books and the like. I don't think it will be like Dracula in terms of the actual numbers of new films and books and things, but there will certainly be a slight surge that will go on. How long it will last after next year is anyone's guess.
Well, I was thinking a few years ago, because Preston Castle up here in the foothills, it's an old reform school for boys that's shut down now. But I remember a few years back they were filming a vampire movie up there, but I don't know what came of it.
I don't either.
Yeah.
But there are some fabulous locations around the Magic Castle, of course, in LA. Was used for a couple of films. And, as you move around the country, I got to go to New Orleans right on the heels of the filming of Interview with the Vampire, and got to visit some of the sites before they had been taken down. And,
sure.
Of course, the sites right along Bourbon Street were quickly put back to normal, but the buildings were still there. And that was a fun trip to New Orleans in the wake of the Interview movie.
Absolutely. We were talking about earlier, the early cases of what people might think would be vampires. How did it evolve from that to a flying bat? Because obviously they didn't have that, in the beginning times it wasn't like that, but suddenly, I wonder if it was just for the movies, that all of a sudden, he could turn into a bat.
No, we have Stoker and Dracula to thank for our tying vampires to a bat. Well, even before Stoker, Goya in some of his paintings had used the bat theme, but it's basically the Texas character. His name. Anyway, most bats are vegetarian.
Okay, yeah, that's true.
And these few species that actually drink blood are Mexican South American species, and so it's with the American character in Dracula that the idea of the blood-sucking bat, the vampire changing into a bat rather than some other animal. Of course, the wolf and the bat, the wolf and the vampire are very much woven together in the folklore in Eastern Europe, but it's in the Dracula novel that the bat is talked about, and Dracula makes a couple of his appearances in the form of a bat, and that's where that comes from.
What do you think attracts people to the thought of vampires?
There are several things. Obviously, sex is one of the things. The vampire bite is a kind of a coding word that one can use for sex, and the teeth that penetrate the neck are very, very phallic-like. There is one delightful movie that was made called Limp Fangs. And the idea was that there was an old vampire who had gone to sleep, and he wakes up in the modern world, and he goes out to bite women, and his fangs, whenever he sees a woman, his fangs get alert and come out. They're strong. And then the first time he tries to bite a modern woman, she just swoons and falls into his arms, and he can't. His fangs won't get erect. And so you can see the obvious implication there, with both the changing times and the nature of the vampire.
Right.
So sexuality is very much part of it, and this is especially true in the comic book vampires, which are aimed at teenagers and young adults. The other part has to do, I think, with the modern understanding of afterlife and immortality. We are very skeptical people. Even many strong religious people have strong doubts about the afterlife. The vampire offers us what we might say as an extended life. Our life is very short. I'm getting on up in years now. I begin to have more thoughts about what the next world is going to be like. The vampire offers us a way of extending our present life. It's not immortality, but it's not death yet. And so the vampire may live hundreds or thousands of years, millions and billions, or everlastingly. So it's kind of an extended stay, a way to skip death, at least for the moment. I think those are the kinds of things. And for the teenagers, and most people who get interested in vampires do so during their teen years or during their 20s. The vampire is a strong character who allows you, in all of the anxiety of adolescence, a way of dealing with the opposite sex. Overwhelmingly, if for only a short time, but for most of us, much longer time, we have problems learning how to be an adult, especially how to relate to the opposite sex, how to relate to those people who are potentially our sexual partners. And the vampire, with his magnetism and his hypnotism, allows us to deal with that anxiety of the real world, and gain some control over this important but frightening part of our growing up. So I think those are the basic three things that vampires do for us.
Sure. Has it always been in the lore that they have to be invited in?
No.
Okay.
To be blunt about it, it's a widespread notion, because the vampire is a product of rural, small town society. Your home is your kind of protection, but we have to remember locked doors and keys, a very modern invention. They don't come about until 300 years ago, maybe, and with the idea of privacy, so that having to invite the vampire in is sort of a way of saying that when you're in your home with your family, that's your protective shield.
Okay.
And as daylight is your protective shield in the day, the closed door in your family is the protective shield. And thus, whether it's locked or not. If it's closed, the vampire cannot penetrate that kind of semi-sacred space, and you can sleep comfortably at night, even
Mm-hmm.
though there is a vampire roaming up and down the pathways near your village right now. Uh, so that's an important part of the lure as it grows and develops and becomes pervasive in some cultures.
Um, I know I'm going to go in a kind of different direction here, but there's been criminals that have studied the vampires and wanting to be like them. I mean, one that comes to mind is one that was living near my house, Richard Trenton Chase.
Oh yes, that's exactly right.
Why do people get that much of a fascination with them to the point where they want to do that? Just like I know there used to be a lot of goths around this area who
Mm-hmm.
actually, well, said they were vampires. So, why is there such a fascination?
Well, I think you're asking two different questions there.
Okay.
One of them, if you may remember Richard Ramirez, the Satanist,
Uh-huh.
who was very much like Chase and who killed different ones of victims, and who had Ramirez had the star that
Uh-huh.
he burned onto the palm of his hand. I think those people are people who are wounded souls, and they are people who are, well, they're like pedophiles. They have something wrong with their psyche, and so they just go out almost uncontrollably and attack victims, and they easily become serial killers. And
Uh-huh.
I think it's the case that with someone like Chase,
Uh-huh.
that he would have been a serial killer, and if he had never heard of a vampire, he would have adopted some other storyline to
Sure.
help perpetuate. He might have become a Satanist, or he could have become a black magician, or
Uh-huh.
whatever. Uh, that's part of it. Uh, for other people, particularly, well, the people in the goth movement, we did several studies of the goth people along the way. Uh, these were people who were wounded souls, and we could use that same language that we use about Chase and Ramirez,
Uh-huh.
but they were creatively working out their problems. They had found there were people we found in the goth movement who had been victimized as children.
Uh-huh.
They were beaten, they were sexually abused, they were isolated, neglected, whatever. And they found in the goth movement, because it was so different, and once you got into it, you were left alone.
Uh-huh.
Your friends were the other goths, and that provided space for people to uh, come to deal with the wound that they had been inflicted upon them, and to grow beyond it. It was one of the healthiest movements I'd ever run into and understood. And over a several year period, when I would move in and out of it, watching the folks, I watched people grow and mature,
Uh-huh.
and they dropped out of their normal growth into the movement at some point, and maybe 5 years, 6 years later, they came back and picked up where they had left off. But now they were healthy, and they had learned how to. Well, there were obviously a lot of women who had been sexually abused, and they came out of the goth movement as something you wouldn't want to mess with. If you were a man wanting to attack a woman, you would not want to attack a former God, and that she would not allow herself to be the victim anymore. And that was a nice thing to watch.
Now, out of all the films that you have a lot of stock, obviously. What do you think is the best vampire film?
What is the best vampire film for me varies from week to week. I at one point when I first did my vampire book back in 1994, I came up with a list of the 25 best, and of course the number has continued to grow, and there were new good ones along the way. So I began to say the reason that this film is the best is different from the reason that film is. The reason that Dracula, the old Lugosi movie, is still among the best movies ever made in this genre is because of its sticking power and some of the things that was the first one to do. And if you know anything about the history of Dracula, how the character Dracula gets adapted to a British drawing room, and then Lugosi comes along and turns it into a really powerful character that's one of the most recognizable literary characters going. That's a great movie. When you get among the Japanese vampire movies, Vampire Hunter D is a fantastic movie for all kinds of different reasons. The artwork, there's this fabulous artist, Amaro, who a Japanese artist. His penmanship is right up there with Jack Kirby and any of the great American artists that we know of who did comic art. And it's a fabulous story. So that's one of the movies you wouldn't want to miss, Vampire Hunter D. There's the Dance Macabre movie that, what's his name? My memory is slipping on me. Is that great B movie guy who made Jack Nicholson's first movie, about the plant that's the vampire. Anyway, that's the movie, stage play with two people. There were two actors. The story is about a vampire who goes out and picks his victims among people who he figures want to die anyway. And so he assuages his guilt about killing people by picking out people who have a death wish. So he picks out this woman who he's been reading her thoughts, and she seems to have suicidal tendencies. And then once he gets with her and lets her know what's about to happen, she talks him into saying things and doing things that kind of keep postponing the event. She finds out he is upset that he hasn't seen the sun, so she takes him out to the Santa Monica pier and puts him under the big spotlight, so he can have some experience of sunlight. And then in the end, I wouldn't give the end away, but she says, "Well, if you're going to kill me, I have a son. I'd like to go see my son for a minute before this happens." So the vampire takes her to see her son. It's a fabulous movie. I would. It gets made remade as Dance of the Vampire later on, but it's great. The original black and white version is
Mm-hmm.
better. I liked Innocent Blood. I don't know if you ever saw it. It starts out with this female vampire who's depressed, and things have become boring. So she's reading the newspaper and she sees this article about a mafia person, and decides, oh, tonight I'll dine a caddy. And so the movie is a delightful comic movie as she goes out and attacks the mafia boss.
It's funny.
Also, it was great. I enjoyed Salem's Lot. I thought the first filming of Salem's Lot was a really great movie, and Salem's Lot was an important book for me, and I read it along the way. I had a friend of mine had given me a copy of Stephen King's first book, The Carrie, which I read in one sitting. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
it's not a huge book, and I just was hooked on Stephen King's work. And then when he comes out with Salem's Lot, this was just a fantastic piece of literature, and I was very, very happy when they made it into a television movie. But you've got the great movies, the Hammer made, particularly the Carmelo movie and the original horror of Dracula.
Mm-hmm.
Those two would stand. The Langella Dracula movie and then the Coppola version. Those were all for different reasons great movies. Stephen King or Christopher Lee is the first Dracula who shows his fangs and who bites his victim on screen.
Mm-hmm.
Langella just brings the romance of it. The relation between him and Nina in the movie is fun to watch. And in the Coppola movie, Coppola's not altogether successful, but his real attempt to bring all of the characters in the original Dracula movie together on screen. Almost all of the Dracula movies cuts characters or mashes them together, and so you miss some of the subplots, which you seem to have to do if you're going to reduce that novel to an hour and a half movie.
Mm-hmm.
Coppola tried to keep all of the major subplots and all of the major characters, and but he does it pretty well. That's one of the better ones to watch.
Cool. What do you say to people that want to start researching this? Where should they start? How should they do it?
Well, I think they should get my encyclopedia to do it. So they certainly need that one to get on the shelf. But there are a number of really good books out on the subject right now that you can get. And I would say get some of the basic survey books that cover the issue of vampires and vampire lore, and one of several Bill Hughes's book on Dracula, for example, would be a good place to go to get started with Dracula. Get a few of the best-selling novels and try to sample some of them from the romance over to the more traditional. The Strand is a pretty good one in terms of the evil vampires and the vampire hordes that are coming to get you. And do that, and then dip into the classic novels. would not start with Dracula as the first novel I read. I got into it maybe 3 times before I actually got past those first chapters and into the flow of the story. And once you get into it, it's great.
Mm-hmm.
It's a little tough going at the beginning. And I Am Legend. That's one of the great novels to
Mm-hmm.
pay attention to. So that's the way I would do it.
Cool, cool, cool.
I'm a bibliophile, and I have this huge uh, uh, selection of Vampire and Dracula books sitting in my house.
I bet
But
you do.
I realize how unusual I am.
I would love to get into your home library and your movies. I would. I would just love to get in there and check it all out. I really would. So how can people get a hold of you if they want to talk to you about this stuff?
I'm there online. I have my basic site is at Baylor University. It has to do with my religious career, but they can contact me through the email addresses that are there on the Baylor site. I welcome fans who want to write and talk about Dracula. I enjoy it as much as anyone. I don't know that I can answer every letter I get, but I try. And, the my new book, The Vampire Almanac, just came out. The
Mm-hmm.
publisher would very much want me to let your audience know about it. Great Christmas present. Go buy a copy right now. Uh, but this is kind of an encyclopedia, and it reads and it's organized like an encyclopedia, and so it tries to touch on everything. So there's a little bit there for everyone,
Sure.
from juvenile novels to scholarly works to even sociological studies. There's an entry on Karl Marx. And Karl Marx's use of the vampire metaphor of Captain Das Crocodile, for example. But it covers the different people who are writing now about. So those are all kind of entry points. Uh, but I'm still into email. I haven't gotten on social media as much, and so email would be the best way if people
Okay.
want to get in touch with me.
Okay, cool. Thank you so much for coming on. This hour blew by. Oh my gosh, I learned so much. And I want to get you on again to talk about this stuff. This is awesome.
I would
This
be
was really
happy
awesome.
to come on, and I would be happy to also refer you to some of my colleagues who might be interesting guests for you. This is my first introduction to California haunts. I, I want to wish you well as this grows and becomes something for the new generation of folks who are working on this topic.
Thank you so much, sir. Well, you have a good evening. It was great.
Take care.
All right, take care. Thank you, sir. Well, that was real fun. That was a fun interview. I learned so much about vampires and my Hungarian roots and connected to vampires. Tomorrow, we're kind of changing gears. Teresa St. Francis is going to be with us, and she is going to be talking about what happens the day after you die. It's kind of a sad thing because she has done work with parents and family members of teenagers who have committed suicide. In the hopes of of the family being able to contact their loved one, and helping with some of that grief with the families. So she's going to be on tomorrow with us at 6:30 p.m. usual time. I know we had sound issues tonight. Nothing I could do about it really, but what I'm going to do is sit tight. I'm going to try because I have to set this up as a podcast anyway. So I'm going to see if I can fix the audio in Adobe Audition tonight and then get it up on the podcast and possibly fix it for the video as well. I did hear what he said, though. It's funny because I'm hard of hearing, and so the way it came out is what I'm normally hearing. But I'll see what I can do with this. I want to thank you guys for coming. If you like the show, share it with 5 people. If you hated the show, share it with 5 of your enemies. Or even share it with 5 of your enemies anyway. Who cares if you liked it or hated it? Just send it out, because we're trying to get the word out. The more the merrier. We want to keep bringing these guests to you guys. Subscribe. That's another thing. Subscribe to our YouTube channel. We're almost there. We're almost to the point where we can actually get a dedicated URL to YouTube. In the meantime, excuse me, I just started to itch. The heat in here is crazy. In the meantime, go to our webpage, www.californiahauntsradio.com, and this video will be on the front page, of course. It goes out live on that page every day. Click on that. You can go to YouTube from there, subscribe. You can subscribe from there. The more subscribers we have, the better things go, and I'm real excited because our numbers have just about tripled in the last month and a half, 2 months, as far as views. So we're really, really starting to launch and take off. So the more people you can tell about us, the better it's going to be. Okay, so just keep sharing and sharing and sharing, just like our podcast numbers are going through the roof, are starting to go through the roof now. Real excited about that. It's taken almost, we're on our 2nd year doing this, and now we're just starting to rise, PayPal.me at California Haunts. Reason why I have that, California Haunts Paranormal Investigation Team is nonprofit, so all the costs for all this stuff comes out of my personal pocket, and I want to keep this show on the air. I really do. And I think you guys like it too, or you wouldn't be coming here to watch it and listen to it and whatnot. So if you could find it in your heart to donate a little bit, that'd be great. It doesn't have to be a lot, but I mean, just to keep this thing going, because it's a good thing. It's a good thing. We learn about ghosts, we learn about vampires, we learn about other things, but we also talk about news topics. We talk about toxic food, we talk about stuff that people are interested in. So if you could find it in your heart to donate, that would be good at paypal.me at California Haunts. Anyhow, with that said, let me get over here and let's see. Gotta get the right buttons, right? I have buttons. I want to thank you guys for coming, and I will see you tomorrow. And again, check in about probably 2 hours, maybe 2.5 hours on the video. And what I'll do is, if I can get the sound going on the audio itself, I'll post the podcast on Facebook, and I'll try and get the video corrected on this. The sound for the video corrected on this as soon as I can, if it's possible. Anyway, I will see you guys tomorrow. Have a good night.